So this article, it starts out by basically saying our jobs are getting more complex. And if you want proof, here it is. Um, you can see my screen now. This is all the different state and federal obligations that we have to disclose things to a buyer. And so let's start. We'll just run through it real quick. You'll see this in an upcoming article. If you're not getting our articles already, let me know. Just email me at christian@rosstitle.com. But start at the top, associations. You've got both HOA, condo, and actually co-ops as well. So these are the different statutes, 718, 719, and 720. Luckily for us, you've got rider A and B for FAR/BAR, as well as the HOA disclosure and condo doc receipt for NABOR. My dad and I were actually looking at this earlier today, and he goes, I really just wish they treated them all the same, but they don't. So that's just the start. Then you have the coastal construction line. A sale of property located partially or totally seaward of the coastal construction control line requires a written disclosure statement at the time of contract. NABOR includes this language for you already, but FAR/BAR actually requires a separate rider. So if you do deals near the coast, a condo on the beach, anything near water, I would say you've got to go the extra step in FAR/BAR and include the rider. And so the first cutout is the coastal construction line section in NABOR, and you'll see that in everything. And then the separate one is the FAR/BAR one. Then you've got code enforcement. I've got a deal on this right now. And this is Florida statute. If a code enforcement proceeding is pending at the time of sale, the seller must disclose it to the buyer. So NABOR and FAR both include this language that nothing is pending. So if something is pending, you've actually got to disclose it. I've got an as-is sales contract. I think it's a NABOR. As-is sales contract. The seller didn't disclose it, and now it's an issue. And the seller's like, well, it's an as-is. Take it or leave it. It doesn't work that way. There's a statute. You could get yourself in a lot of trouble by not disclosing it. And ultimately, it's a constitutional right for the buyer to maybe even get out of the deal. Lead-based paint. This is a thing. So this is federal. It's a federal statute. Federal law requires all sellers or landlords of residential real property built before 1978 to disclose any known information concerning potential lead-based paint hazards and available records. I've got the different statute here. You have to attach the applicable NABOR addendum or FAR/BAR rider. Here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes you don't know. Maybe the house was built in 1982, but which would be after lead-based paint, so that's not a required disclosure, but maybe they added an old door from the 1920s, and that would now require a lead-based paint disclosure. I have seen in my career multiple fines. It's a nasty one. It's like 20 grand. It might be a little less than that. But it's a $20,000 fine, and they tend to fine the brokers on that sort of stuff. Mike, we're going over the scary stuff and why our jobs are important.
Oh boy.
Let's see, am I not hearing it? I may not be hearing it. All right. So that's lead-based paint. Property tax. So luckily, both NABOR and FAR/BAR already include the standard language that basically property taxes might go up upon the sale. A lot of people, they focus a lot on what the property taxes are currently, and they don't really do a good job explaining to the buyer that, yeah, that it's interesting, but it's not really that relevant. We have to look at the millage rate, look at what the house is worth, and then you can evaluate what you think everything's going to be worth. Can you talk, Mike? I want to make sure that we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
All right, good. So that's property tax. Rate on gas. NABOR and FAR/BAR already include this as standard language, naturally occurring, so they cover us on that. Code enforcement. If code enforcement proceeding is pending at the time of sale, the seller must disclose it to the buyer. Both NABOR and FAR/BAR include the language that nothing is pending. It's kind of hidden in some of this, so we'll just keep going. I think I have it on here twice. I'm sorry. That's what it was. All right, so let's keep going. We're past NABOR now, or radon. Sewer lines, a seller must disclose known defects in the property's sanitary sewer line. This is where it gets tricky. And so I'll make this as my little platform here. You have to get your seller to do a seller's disclosure. Even if it's something to do, like an estate or, something where the actual owner of the property doesn't know anything about the property, or it's an as-is contract and they're like, I don't need a seller disclosure. You do. And it's for these next few reasons: sewer lines, sinkhole damage, and subsurface rights. The only place that you can see this language, these required mandatory disclosures, are in the seller disclosure. So seller must disclose known defects of the property's sanitary sewer line. Even though FAR does not have a seller's disclosure, please make sure to include one to stay in compliance. You've got to go through this. Sinkhole damage. Seller of real property. We don't really have sinkholes that much in Southwest Florida. I do believe they're in other parts of Florida, but because we're in Florida, there's a statute. You would add this, if applicable, in any contract via the seller disclosure. Same with subsurface rights. I don't see people doing the subsurface rights enough. Now, in Collier County, the Collier Companies owns almost all of the subsurface oil and mineral rights. As they owned, the Collier family owned the county, millions and millions of acres initially. And as they started selling stuff off, they reserved those oil and mineral rights. So we see them when we do title commitments all the time. Sometimes they can get waived, they can get bought out. We've bought out several. So if you're buying a very expensive property and you want to make sure that, the Collier company doesn't come and try and mine on your property, or, mine for oil or whatever, you can actually buy out their rights. Usually it's like $5,000 or $10,000. I guess it depends on the type of property. But if you know of this, you have to disclose it. And in fact, the seller must provide a prospective purchaser of residential property with a disclosure summary if the seller or affiliated or related entity has previously severed or retained or will sever or retain any of the subsurface rights. This is extra. You got to do it. And so these three things here that you may or may not see, these are in the seller disclosure. It's in here. And so if you got to know about this, you got to fill out the seller disclosure, and you got to make it a part of your job, your responsibility with the seller to make sure that they're in compliance. Dad, this is the fun stuff. So that's all the things that we have to do, that a seller has to do.
Yeah, you want the seller to do it, Christian. You don't want your handwriting on the seller disclosure.
Yeah.
Throw you under the bus.
Point, it used to be easy to be a seller.
Yeah, it used to be a piece of cake when I was a boy.
When you were a boy, talk to me about that. What was it like initially, and kind of how did the time?
I was doing closings in 1980 when I was living in Miami, and I was still in law school. Your brother had just been born. And back then it was buyer beware. The contract was 3 pages long. We didn't have to tell the buyer a darn thing. The only statute that was around, was the condominium statute, which was adopted in '76. So we had to know that. There was no homeowners association statute. We didn't have these other 4,000 statutes that, put the burden on the seller to disclose things to the buyer. And most importantly, probably the biggest seismic shift was the Johnson v. Davis in '85. That was like the whole world changed. It's like what we're going through now in a weird way. It's like, holy crap, we got to disclose all this stuff. And from that, we got all these inspections. They didn't have inspections really. It was really simple.
Yeah.
In the good old days.
Yeah. So I thought that was a really telling thing when you were talking to me this morning. It was a seismic shift that all of a sudden it wasn't caveat emptor. It was, hey, you got to make sure that you're not defrauding the buyer. You got to go above and beyond and disclose things that there's no way they would know about.
And the weird thing, and every lawyer on the planet was operating in Miami, at least where I was at the time, the mindset was, what's the minimum? What do I have to tell? I'd get weird questions like, do I have to disclose that the neighbor's out there at night whacking this big rubber tire with a stick? I actually got that question. You know, do the people across the street argue? Do I have to disclose that? I mean, bizarre, off the wall. And we really didn't know. I mean, the Johnson v. Davis was a leaky roof case, you know. So how does it apply to things in the public records? Well, what are the public records? It could be some filing cabinet in Tallahassee with cobwebs all over it. Or it could be something that would show up in a title search. So it was the lawyers were telling the realtors how to do things, kind of like what we're doing now. And they're the typical lawyer mode, tell them as little as humanly possible, which is I confess my mode, but I've seen it over the years evolve into, I have to give my whole human genome, essentially, if I'm selling a piece of real estate, everything. So it's been a radical shift. I mean, that's the theme when you listed all those statutes. It's like I didn't have to do anything other than the condos back then, and maybe lead paint. I'm not sure when the lead paint, that's federal when that was passed, but it never passed across my desk. I mean, nothing except condos.
So Mike, what's the lesson? What do we glean from that, comparing what it was like practicing in the 70s and 80s to what it's like now? The amount of extra work that has to go into these deals. I mean, that really should solidify our position in this market more than anything. It shouldn't scare us. It should be like, there's a real need for a professional to help a buyer and seller do a deal.
Yeah, when Don started, we used to show property on horses.
I used Ruth's horse.
Now, times change, and some of the forms that we've used or still use are a direct result of what's changing in the industry. For instance, remember when Chinese drywall or defective drywall was the rage?
Yeah.
Back then in 06. And then you had some of the hurricane disclosure forms, Hurricane Ian disclosure form. So things change, and the local board, tend to be very proactive there and try to help protect the industry. And things will continue to change in the future. I mean, it drives me nuts, all these forms we got to use these days, but there are reasons for those forms. And
I remember we had a few agents, Mike, who got sued on the Chinese drywall, and you and I would read the complaint and see what the allegation was. And it was essentially that the agent failed to tell the buyer that there's a thing called Chinese drywall and you might want to check for it.
Yeah.
So we would discuss whether or not we needed both parties to sign disclosure. And the bottom line is, well, no, just the buyer, because they're the ones who will sue.
The question that Don and I get a lot, and I'm sure you do, Christian, also, is do I need to disclose this? And if they're asking that question, more often than not, the answer is yes.
They frame it wrong. I mean, should you disclose it? Is it better for you to disclose it? Because there's also psychological selling benefits by being transparent or seeming to be transparent. You build trust and so forth. Giving the minimum, it sort of comes across to the other side that you're giving the minimum, I believe, and that affects the whole transaction.
So here's the follow-up to that. The seller of real property is not required to disclose the following. Number one, an occupant is or has been infected with HIV or AIDS. And number two, the property was or may have been the site of a homicide, suicide, or other death. That we know for a fact you do not need to disclose. Everything else, disclose. You really should. And the good thing is we're all sales agents. We all are selling something, right? We're selling our services. We're helping a buyer buy a property. We're helping a seller sell a property. We're salespeople. So we have to kind of take all this into account, know what our minimums are, but then know, all right, how do I best protect? Best protect, not minimally protect. How do I best protect while still being able to sell? It's a real balancing act. I'll give you an example from yesterday. And actually, I've had a couple of these just even this morning. The new flood disclosure. So flood disclosure as of October 1st, it's now October 2nd, so we're absolutely in this, requires that the seller disclose any prior flood damage insurance claims. And so you've got properties that have been under contract or have been listed, and they're asking, well, do I have to now disclose extra? And my first point is, didn't you disclose this already? And that's the real question. If they disclosed it already, and now they've been under contract for a little bit now, I think you're okay. I think you're okay. The statute is a little ambiguous as to whether you need to use the specific form if you were already under contract. But if you didn't disclose it previously, that's where I think, yes, I think you should go back, disclose to the buyer, tell them about this insurance claim. They probably already know about it because they've already done an insurance review or gotten a quote. But it is a little tricky. But what would happen if you didn't disclose? What would happen if the buyer finds out on their own? You don't really want that to be the case. And I think we haven't really used that. Whether we're using this new form or not, we've always tried to disclose in the past. So hopefully this doesn't change that much.
And going back to, you're trying to develop a relationship with the buyer or the seller, whichever party you're working with. And a key element for any salesperson is trust. I mean, you need trust with the other person. And what better way to develop trust with that other person than coming across as totally transparent and coupling that with our agency rules in this state that if you're transactional, you only have limited confidentiality. So keeping your mouth shut on issues is extremely dangerous, not only from legal level, but also on the agency level.
Yeah, trust is a big thing. And in fact, I read an article yesterday that there was the Staubach companies that was owned by Roger Staubach from the Dallas Cowboys. He had a company motto, and it was a policy that if you're not 100% satisfied with our service, then you can ask for your money back. And the whole point was to deliver trust, to show, look, if you're not happy, I don't get paid, I'm not happy. So my job, my sole job is to make sure you're happy. And so they're willing to put themselves all the way out there. To that same point, that's why I like as-is sales contracts, because I will let you get out for any reason in your sole discretion. I'll give you 7 days, 10 days, 5 days, whatever it is. Buyer, have at it. I'll take a small risk on the front end that you will terminate, that you'll waste my time, so that in the long term, I can tell you and anybody, hey, you had the opportunity to terminate for any reason, and you chose to move forward anyways. I don't know how much more I can help. It's like 100% money back guarantee during that inspection period. I love that. I think it's total transparency. It's building trust. I don't have to manipulate language and be silly about things like that. And to that point, we actually have more contracts to look at. Aren't you excited, Dad? Hold your breath. All right. So here it is.
I got the class. I got to read this.
Sales contract. It just came out. I think it was uploaded today, in fact, this morning. So I don't know if it's going to be available on your vendor, if you use AppFiles or Simplify.
It takes 6 months for Form Simplicity to get it up online, or
not usually. It'll be up in the next 7 days, but it is on nabor.com. I wanted to quickly go over what the quick changes were so that if you want to take a longer class on this, if you want the CE credits for it, you could. But in the meantime, I think I could probably sum this all up in about 10 or 15 minutes. So number one, they added solar panels and related equipment. See how difficult this is going to be, Dad? This is something.
People still use those, huh?
People still use them. Let's see if I can. All right. So there's our solar panels and related equipment. In the past, we've seen other changes to add audio visual. It seems to be that we're just going to add things every year or two as homes get more complex and things get more expensive or more integrated. You're going to see more and more of that.
I like the home entertainment system. I always point that out to people.
Yeah, well, I don't know how many people use it anymore. I mean, I don't see it built in except for like maybe the highest of end homes, and even then they're getting torn out. They did add the default days for deposits, so 3 and 15. Keep in mind, and Dad, this is something you and I've talked about a lot, that you might owe that second deposit before you even get a seller response. So just guide your buyer. You got to give them that heads up ahead of time, because if they find out, oh, I thought I was going to get the seller to say yes before I owed that extra 100 grand. It doesn't work that way. So do the timing.
You got to tell them they have 10 days to respond, and you're probably not going to know.
You're probably not going to know.
I usually tell my sellers or the listing realtor to just tell the other side that, well, they're working on it. You know,
Right.
You don't give them a flat no right off the bat. We're working on it.
Exactly.
Where's that deposit?
So the next thing that we've seen be a problem only in the weirdest of situations is when the closing happens and the seller's like, well, I haven't gotten my money yet. And they
Right.
won't give keys, they won't give access. It really doesn't work that way. Once you are officially closed, once the closing agent has all the money, all the signatures, all the terms of the contract have been satisfied, closing, it's done. The money and how the money is paid or received by the seller, that comes later. And so you'll actually see this put later. We'll go to it later on in the contract. But up here, they're talking about giving access. So seller shall vacate and give access and possession to the property. So keys, door fobs, gate codes, all of that needs to happen as soon as we are officially closed, according to the closing agent. We do have sellers who say they will not move out until the money hits their account. Don't let your customer do that. Tell them early, tell them often. If you think it's going to be a problem, we need to add it to the contract to protect that seller or to protect that buyer. This is a big change.
Lawyers raised that issue, Christian, that they weren't going to give access until the money arrived. And I would point out that wiring is not a requirement of the buyer. There's no obligation that the money be wired. It's
Yeah.
courtesy.
And I think that goes to also, I really don't like outsiders, people who are not from here, doing closings here,
Yeah.
because they don't know what's normal. They don't know how to read or take context out of this contract, and it causes problems. So, there are problems even for people that are, located here in town, but it happens a lot more when you have an outsider come in and try and be involved on a closing. This is a big change here, and this is on special assessments. So they basically modified the contract to match a little bit more closely with how FARBAR does theirs. So notwithstanding the above, if a special assessment is levied as of the effective date and may be paid in installments, and then you get to check, seller or buyer shall pay installments due after the closing date. So if seller is selected, seller shall pay the applicable special assessment in full at the time of closing, unless the special assessment is not payable in advance, in which case the amount of special assessment shall be credited from the seller to buyer at closing. So this has always been a little tricky, is, the seller has a special assessment and they're paying it monthly or quarterly, and there's 10 years left. The way the contract used to be is that the seller would pay the whole thing at closing. So even though they disclosed it and the buyer was aware of it, if they didn't modify the contract, the seller was then obligated to pay the balance of that assessment at closing. So now we're giving you a chance to change that. So you can
Is
check.
there a default, Christian? I don't see the default.
I don't know. I don't see a default.
If neither block is checked, then what?
It says if left blank, then seller. So there you go.
Okay, I didn't see it. All right.
So seller pays all the installments due after by default, which is how the contract was originally. But
Okay.
if you want the buyer to take over existing special assessments, if you want them to take over some sort of installment plan, you would select buyer. Let's see, we'll go to the next one. And this next one is something that will not impact you guys on a daily basis. This is regarding title curative issues. So it's really something that I am more focused on. Basically, it allows the title company to object to a new title issue after the initial commitment. So the way title works, at least in our office, is that we order a title exam, we do a search right up front. In the first couple of days, we do that search. But closing may not be for another 30 days. And in that time, we've gotten a survey, we've got maybe the seller got sued, who knows? And so this just reiterates or kind of clarifies that the buyer can make a second title objection if something new comes up, including if you get a survey and the survey it turns into a title issue. So there was a little bit of vague language that it was hard to know exactly how it worked as to whether you could get a second bite of the apple. Now you can. It should clean things up. It makes a seller responsible for fixing title issues the way we always wanted it to.
Any title issue, like a judgment, anything at all?
Yeah.
Great. Like it.
So it doesn't change the definition of a title issue. It just expands when you can object to them. The next one is flood disclosure. So we talked about all the existing disclosures. The newest one, as of October 1st, is this flood disclosure. Buyer should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the required flood insurance disclosure. Now, this language does not necessarily protect the seller too much because the seller still has to make sure the buyer signs that flood disclosure. This is something that can't necessarily be waived. I think this just reminds us, hey, we got to do this. And in fact, while we're in this section, you'll notice a lot of the stuff that I pointed at the beginning of this call, like radon gas. Here's that language. Lead-based paint, there's that language. Property tax disclosure, there it is for that. So this is where a lot of those disclosures fall into.
So Christian, the flood disclosure form should be executed at the time the agent is getting the listing with the seller?
Absolutely. So the best practice is when you get that listing, you're going to get the flood disclosure signed, the seller disclosure signed, and then if it's in a condo association, you get all the condo docs, everything. If it's in an HOA, you're going to have them fill out the HOA disclosure. If you're using FAR/BAR, it's going to be the rider A and rider B. You're going to download a copy of the deed, and you're going to know who signs, who owns. You're going to know everything. If it's in a trust, you're going to have a copy of the trust. If it's in an estate, you're going to have all the estate paperwork from probate. All those things are going to be included in your job up front. Some listing agents, I'll notice, they don't do it until they have an offer. That's not ideal. Don't do that. Do it right up front when no buyers are breathing down your neck.
Yeah, I don't think sellers realize that this is going to show up when the buyer applies for an insurance policy. If they made a claim, it's going to show up. So
right.
They resist it.
Yeah, it will show up. They did add for radon. This is just to clarify. It would be a defect if the radon average is above 4.0. What is that? How do you say that, Dad? Picocuries? I don't even
Picocuries.
Per liter of air. So if the average is over 4.0, then it's a defect. If you had a little spike, but the average was below 4.0, it's not a defect. Again, that sort of example goes back to why I like as-is contracts. Because this is not, in my mind, I don't want a gotcha moment. I don't want to say, buyer, gotcha, not a defect. Right. That's my take. I want the buyer, if it's really an issue, and the seller doesn't think it's an issue. The seller says, no, I'm not fixing the radon. It's below the average. It's fine. And the buyer's like, no, it means something to me. I terminate. Then the seller needs to understand, maybe you were wrong. Maybe it meant that much. And so now you got to find another buyer, and maybe that changes how the seller thinks. I don't think there's a problem with that. I think that is legitimate. It helps the buyer stay happy, feel like they're not being manipulated. It makes sure that the buyer's not turning on the agent as well. That being said, I understand in this town, most people use the standard. I get it. I'm trying to fight for it. All right. This one I objected to. I did not want this to be included, but they added sunken pavers as a cosmetic item and not.
Oh, God help us.
So not thrilled about that. I think that uneven pavers is one thing, but a sunken paver, I think that should be a defect. If the seller doesn't want to fix it, okay, that's fine. I don't think it's cosmetic. You know, if there's sunken pavers all over the place, or you know, it's a danger. I don't know. But the rest of the committee disagreed with me, and they voted in favor to adding it. Risk of loss. So we wrote a storm article. Did I send that out, Dad? Did we? I think
I
that's
don't think so, Christian.
no. I'll send it out
What
this
you did
weekend.
last weekend? Why not last weekend?
Yeah, I think we sent it on Monday talking about risk of loss. Well, they changed it. They didn't change it drastically. They just kind of clarified how it works. So you can probably just skip over this. They talk about initially the risk of loss was weird because they said a casualty event was only something that caused damage. But then separately, they would say, but if a casualty event led to the title company not being open, then the buyer and seller can delay. Well, they're different casualty events. So they cleaned it up. So in the event of fire, flood, storm, extreme weather conditions, or other casualty occurring between the effective date and contract, whichever is earlier. So they're saying that the storm itself is the casualty. Then they say what happens about it. So this is a good thing. That was a mistake in the prior contract.
So it has nothing to do if the title company's not open, like when we were going through COVID.
No, it still does. Still does. It's
Okay.
just that previously, if anyone was paying attention, the contract was actually wrong because you couldn't get the extension if there was no damage to the property, whether the closing was, you know, the title company was open or not. So I think they fixed a glitch. Let's say that. This one is interesting. There's a new statute. If the real property is located within a portion of a building or within a multiple parcel building as defined in section 193, buyer should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the condo multiple parcel building addendum, which is attached to and made a part of this contract. Let's see if I can find that form because I do have it.
What the heck is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have no clue.
I mean, either it's a condo or it's something else.
Here it is. So this is the addendum to sales contract condo multiple parcel building for condominiums. So this is only for condominiums created with a portion of the building or within a multiple parcel building. Buyer hereby acknowledges the following. Condominium in which your unit is located is created within a portion of a building or within multiple parcel building. The common elements of the condominium consist only of the portions of the building submitted to the condo form of ownership. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to say those amenities may or may not be a part of your common elements. I guess there have been some pretty tricky deals, especially, you know, if there was damage, if there was foreclosures, and they realize, oh, someone else actually owns the pool and the clubhouse. So this is supposed to kind of clarify that. We're gonna have to do a whole article on this one because it is a little confusing as to what properties apply to this and which ones don't.
Well, this isn't just condominiums that are built on 3 parcels that are pieced together. It's condominiums that are owned, or like the golf course is owned by the developer, or the social amenities are owned by the developer.
Yeah, so it's a condominium created within a portion of a building. So if you have a huge building, let's say it's a hotel and
Right.
residence.
Ah,
So they're building those. And let's say the Ritz-Carlton owns the first 20 floors, and then there are residences the next 20 floors.
there's Marriott or Marco.
Kind of. I don't think they sell. I mean,
They have some condos in one tower.
yeah, but it's separate. I think it's a separate parcel. So maybe, but maybe the Marriott is a good example. But I know for sure the Ritz would be in those scenarios where you may or may not have access to all the amenities on site. And so this has to be disclosed. We'll have to dig more into this and see, you know, what's affected by it. That's a fun one.
You get the Ritz in Coconut Grove where there's condos.
Yeah, they're condos and hotel all in the same building. So I would say in those scenarios, for sure, that's how it applies. Membership approval. So this is something that has been a problem over the years, and I hope that we're fixing it. They basically say that this membership approval period only starts 10 days after the receipt of the applicable association application from seller. So that the seller has to give them those applicable application form. That's when the timing starts.
Ooh.
Previously, they kind of put the onus entirely on the buyer, even if the seller kind of gave them the wrong form or gave them the wrong association to apply to. This one kind of cleans that up and says, seller, you really have an obligation to give this form, this application to the buyer. And if they don't get approved, then it goes back to being a seller's issue because they didn't give it to them initially.
They
So
should
that's a
provide
big,
that with a seller's disclosure, I would assume, something like that.
yeah, you could include it on MLS. Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a follow-up to page 1 about access and possessions. Timing of seller's receipt of seller's proceeds is not a prerequisite to seller's obligation to vacate the property and give access and possession to buyer once the closing is confirmed in writing that the closing agent has initiated the disbursement of seller's proceeds and officially declared the transaction closed. This gives a lot more clarity. It's not the best written sentence in the world, but a lot more clarity that for a couple of things. One, the closing agent declares the transaction closed. They're the ones who have the authority to do that. Number two, getting your proceeds is not a prerequisite to being closed. And number three, kind of at the least, the closing agent must confirm in writing that they have initiated the disbursement in order to say that they're closed. So that's how we do it. In fact, this has been a problem. We had a big closing on Monday, and we were not the closing agent. We were representing the seller. The closing agent said, "Hey, we're closed. We'll send out wires shortly." And then they didn't actually send the wire until the next morning. That's not okay. That's almost a violation of the contract. And in fact, it could be something that the seller could put the buyer in default over. So, title companies were not a party to the contract, but we do have some responsibilities, and it gives some clarity as to what needs to happen.
So initiated the disbursement, does that pertain to wires, Christian? Because you have until 11:59 at night to close. You're not going to wire money at 11:58.
But you can initiate the wire, maybe. You can say, "Hey, we've set it up and sent it. We'll have to wait for the morning for the bank to execute." With wires, it takes two to tango. You have the initiating bank actually send it, and then you have the receiving bank post it. So even if what I've learned with banks is that even if it's been received at the bank level, the next step is that the bank actually puts it into the different accounts. It doesn't happen automatically. So there's someone that actually at the bank says, "Oh, that's Mike Hughes's money. Let's put it in that account," and then you see it. Even if the money's been received, even if the initiating bank has debited that money and doesn't have it anymore, it may not have been indexed in the customer's account yet. Last couple of things. They've added a few of these check boxes. Dad, you and I were talking about this previously, but you've got your compensation agreement and you've got your concession agreement. Now you can check that box if it's part of your offer. And then the last one is that multiple parcel building addendum. It's a good reminder. Hey, is this multiple parcel building? And then finally, last thing, this contract shall not modify the listing contract or other offer of compensation made by seller or listing broker to buyer's broker.
Huh?
I don't know why they put that in there.
What does that mean again?
I don't know. I think what it means, here's
I
the
need a cup of coffee.
Your listing agreement is separate from the sales contract, which is separate from the buyer broker agreement. And the only way you can tie them together is to have that compensation agreement between brokers or between seller and broker, or between seller and buyer potentially. So you have to have in writing somewhere else if you're going to talk about compensation. You can attach it as an addendum, but it's almost like a separate item.
Now, none of those blocks pertain to buyer broker agreements. They pertain to the seller agreeing to pay the buyer broker or the listing broker agreeing to pay the buyer broker.
They just say compensation. So I don't even know what form that is.
No, but the listing agreement you never have to give unless you're part of an MLS disciplinary action, and the same thing with the buyer broker agreement.
Well, so you make a point. You said that you shouldn't ever have to show your listing agreement to another person. Well, let me open your eyes to this piece.
You give me a headache, Christian.
No, I'm giving myself a headache. So this is one of the newer forms that they created, addendum to sales contract compensation. This is what you would add if you don't know what the listing broker is offering. So you say, hey, we want to make our offer. It's contingent upon getting a compensation agreement that you'll be paying us 2.5%, 3%, whatever.
Yeah, a broker to broker, or
right.
a seller to buyer broker.
Or there's another form for concessions. So there's the same form. It looks the same, but it's for concessions. This one, though, both of these forms require a copy of a binding agreement establishing compensation to be paid by buyer. I thought it was in here.
Compensation to be paid to buyer's broker. So it could be the seller to buyer broker, but you're not going to attach a copy of the buyer broker agreement itself between the buyer's broker and the buyer.
I could have sworn it was in here.
Yeah. It's not
maybe
like
it's not. All right, maybe it's not. That would be good. I thought it was. Hold on.
Yeah.
Buyer concession agreement.
I was watching something yesterday on this.
Not that one. Well, I am corrected. I stand corrected. I could have sworn it was in there, but it doesn't seem to be. Okay, well, that's good. Now I don't have to complain about it.
Yeah.
I could have sworn that there was a form in there that said you'd have to show your buyer broker agreement, or you'd have to show your listing agreement itemizing how that money is being paid, but maybe not. So that's good. I am seeing that there are brokers in town that do require a copy or request or demand a copy of their listing agreement. I'm not a fan of that. I think anything that can be confidential shall be confidential, but you kind of have to guide that. You don't want to upset the apple cart for no real gain. So you don't want to say no just to say no. You kind of want to see how badly do they want it, and what are we really protecting ourselves against.
There's a Florida Realtor seminar I was watching yesterday, Christian. It wasn't Joanna Watkins, it was the other lady, and she got into the importance of keeping your buyer broker agreements to yourself, not emailing them back and forth, because that's going to open a bunch of other legal issues. The same philosophy behind the listing agreement. You don't email that to everybody and their brothers.
Mike, you had a public service announcement about buyer broker agreements.
Yeah, I was just going back to contract law. It's important to give the buyer a copy of that buyer broker agreement. When the buyer says that I never got a copy of the agreement, I didn't know that we had a fully executed buyer broker agreement. And you could see picture a Port Royal deal, and someone says, here's a note.
And the buyer's an attorney.
Yeah.
God help you.
or has attorneys on staff. That's right. So a couple of things on that. It's a great public service announcement. Your buyer signs it, your seller signs it, they send it back to you for signature, and then you just put it in your pocket and you don't do anything with it. You have to then share it back with them, the fully executed version. Hey, congratulations. Thank you for signing.
Delivery. It's just like delivery.
Yeah, because otherwise, potentially that is the buyer has made an offer of a contract, but you never delivered acceptance. So the buyer could terminate it and cause you some problems. Now, I could see some areas where it probably wouldn't be a problem, right? So you could probably, if you then did a sales contract, you're under contract, and the day of closing, the buyer says, I don't want to pay you, you're fired, I revoke. It's a little tricky because you're actually getting paid by the listing broker a lot of times, and your name is on the listing contract. You have a broker compensation agreement with the listing broker. I don't know, that would be a tricky thing because it's not a valid BBA, but kind of looks like one. The worst scenario is if the buyer was agreeing to pay you directly. So the buyer's going to pay Mike Hughes $1 million for compensation, And then the day of closing, it says, take that line off the the settlement agreement because we don't have a deal and I revoked my BBA. I never got it fully executed. That's a huge issue because what am I going to do? I don't know. That would be tough.
Well,
I
the
mean,
interesting thing, get back to what Mike was saying, is we're doing these buyer broker agreements that hit the 4 points required by the settlement, but the settlement doesn't require it to be a contract. It just says you have to have these 4 points and the buyer has to, I guess, agree to it. I mean, you don't have mutual
Yeah, you don't
consideration.
have
you don't
mutual,
remedy.
it is an agreement, but not, it's like
It's a written
unilateral.
agreement, but is it an enforceable contract? Who knows?
It's not a mutual agreement, it's unilateral. It might be good enough, but
Yeah.
it'd be weird. Don't do that. Just send them
All
the
right.
fully executed.
actually, Don raises an interesting point because let's say the buyer wants to dump the realtor and use another realtor. Could this be their out, or under Don's thinking maybe this would not be their out?
Well, this is
It definitely gives them an out. I mean, whether they can get away with it or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But it definitely puts you in some pretty hot water. And then they could probably file an ethics complaint down at the local board. They can make your life pretty miserable.
well, that's probably where procuring cause hearings will kick in. Maybe.
Yeah, but that's not between a buyer and a broker. That's from
That is
between
true.
two brokers. So it's and that puts the listing broker in hot water because who are they supposed to pay the money to?
Well, actually, if you look at the Florida Realtors, their 3 buyer broker agreements, one of them is enforced by the local board. The other 2 you have to go to court. Some I don't know if that makes it any clearer. Maybe not.
Yeah, here's the clarity. Don't do it. Right?
Don't do what?
Mike, any other advice for us us children?
Yeah, it's a lot calmer this week with no hurricane out there that we got to think about. I mean, this is the
Don't
bottom.
jinx us, Mike.
Feeling a lot better this week.
Yeah.
last
Yeah,
week-
no, it's gone pretty well. I know that some people did get some damage from storms. Make sure you disclose. If you have a seller disclosure, do a new one, do an updated one. I did one last piece of advice. We had a seller's disclosure that was done. Then they realized they were missing something, so they wanted to add it in. And then they realized they were missing something else. And they started to get a little lazy and they're like, I don't want to do a whole new seller disclosure. At the end of the day, you're still a salesperson. And so I don't like the idea of a buyer seeing that you modified the seller disclosure like 10 times. I think that's a bad look. I want a clean seller disclosure because then I'll think it's clean. I want it typed out. I want it as clean as humanly possible because the messier it is, the more subconsciously the buyer will think it's a messy deal. So try not to do that. Try and use the systems that we have. Just go the extra step. Create a new seller disclosure, get it signed. All right. Thank you guys. Have
All
a
right,
great
thank
week.
you.